Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Mental Health UK's first webinar. Now, the disappointing news is that it's still January, but it is Friday, and by the end of this webinar, you'll be closer to lunch than you were to breakfast, and hopefully you'll have some things to take away from this session today that you'll be able to use in your workplaces from Monday onwards. So it's a very warm welcome to everybody. My name is Katie and I'm the Director of Strategy and Partnerships at Mental Health UK. Mental Health UK is one of the UK's leading charities in workplace mental health in this country. And I'm delighted today, as part of our first webinar, to be interviewing my colleague, Sarah Murphy. Sarah is our Associate Director of Advice, Information and Training. Good morning to you, Sarah.
Morning, Katie. How's it going?
Yeah, very well. Thank you. Yourself?
Yes, good. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent stuff. Right. Now, today's session is all about how to look after your own well-being whilst managing the mental health of your team. And our webinar sessions are going to be really focused on solutions, how to. So that's what we're really going to be taking a deep dive into today. And I wanted to let you know before we get going that we've got the question and answer session function enabled on this webinar, so you can post your questions through to us at any time, and we'll prepare lots of time at the end of this session to make sure that we cover as many of those as we can. We're also recording today's session and we'll be sending it out to you later on today, and any of the tools that we talk about as we go through to this session, so that you can watch back again, use the tools, and also share on to other colleagues as well. So let's get straight into it then, Sarah. So you've been working in mental health for over 10 years now. Tell us, does it, with all of that experience, ever get any easier?
Yeah, coming up to 12 years now in working for a mental health charity. And I guess in terms of does it get easier, depends what you're talking about. Certainly talking about mental health has become more accepted. You know, we're having this webinar today. That wouldn't have been happening 10 years ago. But when you're talking about sort of managing other people and sort of your own well-being and sort of really being concerned sometimes about the well-being of your team, I would say probably no, that doesn't necessarily get any easier. There's always new challenges, new people that you're working with that you have to worry about, and sort of who would have expected COVID. So, you know, there are always sort of those unknowns ready to pounce on you and can sometimes knock you a little bit off kilter. So there's no time to become complacent about it, I would say.
Absolutely. Well, I guess in some respects that's a little disappointing to hear, but reassuring that even with all of the knowledge and practice that you've had in dealing with this day in, day out, and working, you know, within the mental health sector, that we're all very much in the same boat here. So let's begin to really break this down now. You know, I think it's sort of well documented as to why protecting your own mental health is important. But what are the risks for us as managers if we don't do this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few kind of cliches out there around you can't pour from an empty cup, I think is the first one. And that's really the message I want to get across today. If anyone takes anything away from today, you know, we as managers, we're not superhuman. When we get recruited into a managerial sort of a line management role, we don't suddenly develop superhuman powers. We are still people, and if we aren't looking after our own mental health and well-being, then it is going to have an impact on both the people that we manage, our family relationships, our friend relationships, and potentially the work that we do, and therefore the organisation that we also work for. So I think there can be real risks to a wide range of stakeholders if we don't look after ourselves as managers.
No, that's totally understandable. And so let's really break this down then. So we understand the why, as we've talked about. We now understand the risks in a bit more detail. Where do we start? What's the first step to managing your own mental health and that of our teams?
I think the first thing to remember is, again, we are just people too. And in the same way that we would perhaps talk about the mental health and well-being of our staff or even our friends or our relatives, it's about understanding that we do all have mental health and that we all can move around a bit of a continuum, we normally call it, where if things are happening to us that can impact on how we are feeling and how we are functioning, and it can start to mean that our mental health will deteriorate. And the model that I think is a really good one, particularly it's a good visual, and I know that we're going to send this out to everybody afterwards, is the stress bucket model. And that's where, you know, you kind of have a visual. Like, I always imagine myself carrying in the bucket, but perhaps you feel that the bucket is within you. But the nub of it is we all have a stress bucket. And mine might be a different size to yours. So there might be situations where someone might be able to deal with a bit more stress than somebody else. So it's important not to compare yourself, because we all have different experiences, and that can shape sort of the size of our stress buckets. But basically, we all have stresses in our lives, every single one of us. And the nice visualization is that perhaps think of those stresses as clouds raining down water into our stress bucket, or stress into our stress bucket. And those stresses will be, you know, there'll be some that are common for everyone. We all have relationships, and sometimes they can be quite stressful, whoever they're with. We all have to deal with money, and finances can be stressful. Probably everyone on this call will have work, and there can be various stresses that are involved in work. So all of us have these clouds raining down stress into our stress bucket. Sometimes it might be a drip, 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 and other times it might feel like it's this kind of storm and a big torrential downpour into our buckets. So the important thing to remember is that this is the same for all of us. You have a stress bucket, and so do the people that you manage. It's natural to have a bit of stress in your stress bucket, but what's important is that that stress doesn't start to rise to a certain level where you start to become unwell, basically mentally unwell, where you start to feel bad and you're not able to function. So that's the first tip. It really is to accept that you all have this and sort of be able to visualize that you've got this stress bucket. The second tip really is to be able to recognize when that stress level is getting to the point where you might start to become unwell. And we can all stress and sort of pressure or undue pressure can manifest itself in our bodies in different ways. So you might have physical symptoms. So for me, I'll often get tense shoulders if I'm feeling a bit stressed. I might start to get headaches. You might have behavioural signs that can be little alarm bells. So for me, it's often not sleeping. I'll go to sleep fine, but then I'll probably wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and then I won't be able to go back to sleep. And then I'm obviously tired and probably not in the best form for the rest of the day. It might be that you have emotional changes. So you might feel a bit teary. You might find that you're feeling a bit more snappy or angry than you normally are. And sometimes it can change our thoughts. So again, for me, 2 o'clock in the morning, I'll wake up, but then my thoughts will be racing, and I'll be thinking of emails that I need to write or conversations that I need to have. So the important thing then is to recognise if you are having any of these warning signs that actually stress is starting to impact on your mental health. And it's important to notice that you might have a physical symptom, but actually that's a physical symptom of stress or starting to get a mental health problem. So recognising those signs in yourself is really important, and it can be hard to do. You know, you might just be thinking, oh, well, I've not slept well for the last few days, and just brush it off. But actually trying to think about, oh, what might be the reasons for that? Is it because I'm actually feeling a bit stressed?
That's certainly really interesting and really helpful, because I think when I talk to my team about how I'm feeling, it is such a natural reaction, I think, in all of us to start to think about comparing. I'm not sleeping well, my colleague's sleeping well, is there something wrong with me? But no, actually, as you say, we all experience these things in slightly different ways, and our bodies react kind of quite differently. And I think it's also really interesting to hear that, you know, that everybody's bucket is a slightly different size, and that we all have the ability to manage things in a slightly different way. So we've got this bucket, we've identified some of these symptoms, these things that are presenting themselves to us in a way that make us understand that we need to do something about our well-being. What are the options? What do you do with the information once you spot those signs in yourself?
Yeah, so we'll stick with the stress bucket sort of visual, because what we need in our stress bucket is holes or taps. Some people like to think about it as holes. I kind of think about it as taps. But however you think about it, the important thing is that you need to find a way to let some of this stress out of your bucket. And there are healthy ways to do that, and there are unhealthy ways to do that. So some of the healthier ways that we would recommend are kind of thinking about some research that was done by the New Economics Foundation, where they found that there were 5 ways to well-being. So if some of your taps or your holes are linked to these 5 ways to well-being, then that's probably quite a positive thing. So one of those ways is to be active, to be physically active. And that might be going for a big long run or a cycle and doing some kind of high intensity class. But it could also be going for a stroll, having a dance around your living room. You know, it's something around just keeping your body active, and they've shown that that has a positive impact on your well-being. The other way, or one of the other ways, is about connecting with others. And you know, sometimes it's hard, it's easy to say, oh, I won't pick up the phone to my friend, particularly now, you know, we can't meet up with people face to face like we could do before. And you think, oh, well, I won't give so and so a ring because, you know, they've got their own lives, they're doing their own thing, they don't want to be bothered by me. But actually, when has that ever happened that you've rang someone and they've not wanted to talk to you, and they've not also wanted that human connection probably just as much as you have? So connecting with others is key, and that could be over the phone, it might be over a Zoom, if you are lucky enough to be able to see somebody in a bubble at the moment, outside perhaps, then that's another good one. But connecting with others is a key way. Learning something new. So when I've spoken to people before about things that they find are positive for their well-being, often people will talk about crafting. I had one lady tell me about she used to make mosaics, and I know particularly during lockdown a few people have sort of dusted off instruments that they used to play as a child. So, you know, if you've got your flute or your clarinet up in the loft, but learning something new is also shown to have a positive impact on your well-being. Giving to others is another way, and you might think about that as kind of a traditional volunteering option. That might be more difficult at the moment, but you know, is it possible to do some shopping for a vulnerable kind of shielding neighbour at the moment, you know, and have that kind of good positive feeling that you've done something nice for others? There are charities who are always looking for volunteers, perhaps to help people over the telephone. So, you know, there could be other ways to give to others, but it might just be, you know, sending a card to a friend or relative, because who doesn't like to receive a handwritten card through the post? That always makes you feel good, and it makes you feel good for making somebody else feel good as well. And then finally, the last sort of way to well-being that they found is about sort of paying attention or being mindful. And again, that can be difficult, feel like it's impossible at the moment, but it can just be stopping when in front of the kettle while you're making a cup of tea, and just really focusing on the process of making that cup of tea, rather than allowing other sort of busy work thoughts to enter your head. It could also be going for a walk, you know, around a park, and just sort of noticing the trees, seeing if you can hear any bird song. So that simple things that you can do, and particularly be able to do it during a lockdown as well.
I think for me that sounds really interesting, and thank you for giving such a wide repertoire of options and opportunities here, because again, going back to what you said with regards to the stress bucket, everybody's individual and unique in this. So again, it's about not comparing yourself to others and what they're doing, but actually sort of really listening to yourself and understanding you know, what's good for you, what works for you, and kind of really taking that forward. I'd imagine in amongst all of that, it's possibly something that you might want to check in on sort of fairly regularly with yourself, just to make sure that you are keeping an eye on some of those things and that you're keeping those taps regularly flowing.
Absolutely. It almost feels, when you are feeling stressed, then going for a walk or picking up the phone to someone are often the first things that will drop off your list, because you might be thinking, well, I've just got this huge to-do list, it's so overwhelming, I haven't got time for any of the, you know, having a bath, or like I said, going for a walk. But it's precisely that you do need to do those things to be able to relieve some of that stress, because you are going to have to go back to work. More stress probably is going to start drip or pouring in, And it's so important to keep those taps running. And even if you have to schedule something in your diary, you know, a bit of organised relaxation or organised fun, it's important to do, and not to forget that, oh, actually I haven't even been out the house for a week, you know, and to actually make the effort, put your shoes on and go for a walk.
Yeah, fantastic. So that's a really good start. We've talked about self, and we said at the beginning that's so important, and we talked about the risks of not looking after yourself in the first instance. But and I'm sure there's an awful lot that we can talk about, and we'll go into this in many webinars over the rest of the year, I've no doubt. But now let's turn our focus a little bit to team, and about how to strike that balance. And where would you start in terms of having that conversation and beginning to discuss that with your team? And I think in essence that really that balance piece is quite important, isn't it?
Yeah. I think there's a few key things here. I think one is, and I say this a lot, you know, as I said, managers are people too, and oftentimes you might get recruited or promoted into a managerial role because you've got excellent technical knowledge, you've got a really great skill set in a particular area. What employers don't often do is recruit people into managerial roles specifically because of their soft skills. So having that conversation with a staff member, either about your own mental health and well-being or about theirs, can feel quite difficult for a lot of people, and people will often lack the confidence to start that conversation. What if I say the wrong thing? What if someone says something back to me and I don't know how to respond? So there's lots of what ifs, which can just turn people off from having that conversation, and that's fair enough. But like with any skill, it is a skill, it's a soft skill, then it is possible to learn it. So if you feel actually a bit nervous in having those conversations and perhaps you don't have the confidence, then you know there are training courses that you can go on where you can be taught and get the chance to practice those skills. And we at Men's Health UK, one of our more popular courses is Men's Health in the Workplace for Managers, where we do cover off a framework that people can use to feel more confident having those conversations. So I think that's the first thing, is recognise whether you feel confident in having that, and if not, learn a new skill. You know, one of the 5 ways to wellbeing there. I think the other thing is around role modelling. So there are tools that you can use with your staff in order to explore and support their mental health and wellbeing at work. But again, going back to that key point is, you know, managers are people too. We can use those tools for ourselves. And I think it's quite important to also role model the behaviours that you expect to see in your staff. So, for example, there's a really useful tool called a wellbeing action plan, and that's where you sit down and have a bit of a think around, well, what does good mental health and wellbeing look like for me? How am I behaving? How am I feeling? How am I acting? And sort of jotting that down. Thinking about, kind of going back almost to the stress bucket there, around, well, what are some signs that perhaps I'm starting to not feel very well? Is it that I'm complaining of headaches? Is it that I've come in to work again and said, oh, I didn't sleep again last night? What are those little alarm bells that mean that you might start to be sliding down towards you know, a period of poor mental health? Jot those down. Have a think about, well, are there some certain triggers that will sometimes make me feel that way? That can be quite hard to do, because again, it can often just feel quite overwhelming, but taking the time when you are feeling good to sort of reflect back is a useful process. And then importantly, on the wellbeing action plan, what do I want other people to do if they notice that I'm starting to feel this way or act in a certain way? And that might be something that you want your manager to do. Do you want them to have a word with you and you know, talk about perhaps adjustments to work? What do you want your colleagues to do? Do you want them to mention something, or do you want them to just leave you alone? What works for you when you're feeling that way? So it's important for you to have one of those plans and share it with your manager, because like I said, we are people too, we are employees, we've got managers as well. And to share that with them and to make sure that they're clear about how they can support you with your mental health. But it might be that you want to share that with your team so that they can be aware as to those warning signs that you might be feeling stressed. And then it's also, you know, if you're doing that, if you've got a wellbeing action plan, then having that conversation with your staff member about them having a wellbeing action plan should be a lot easier. And it just becomes the norm. It just becomes how we do things around here, and that we are keeping an eye out and a focus on each other's well-being.
I think that's such an important point to remember from this as well, actually, is as people managers, certainly I find that I think an awful lot about my team and about the support and interaction that I need to have with them, but it is about remembering to lift your head back up. And for most people, possibly with the exception of business owners and leaders, which is a webinar for another day, everybody has somebody that they can speak up to as well if they're existing within that middle management sort of space. And it's about recognizing that those tools aren't just there for your team, but as you say, they're very much there for you too. And that does sound like an incredibly powerful way to instill the value of those ideas and that creativity if you're able to role model that up yourself as well. So that's really helpful. And so I think what's interesting for me is all of that is sort of predicated on being able to have a good conversation with your team or with particular members of staff. But you, as we've talked at the very beginning, you need to be in the right capacity to be able to do that in the first instance. If you've identified some of these signs in yourself, you're trying all of the tools that we're talking about here, but you find that you're still really struggling, what should you do?
Yeah, that it is really difficult. And I think there is a lot of pressure on managers that, like I said earlier, that we are in some way superhuman. And if we have to admit that we're struggling, that's in some way a weakness. I think there's still a bit of stigma around poor mental health and well-being and mental illness in particular, that if you are struggling, then in some industries, then you may be perceived as weak, and does that in some way impact on your ability to be a strong manager or leader? But we are all humans, you know, chief executives. There've been a number of chief executives, one quite recently sort of in the fintech world, where they've acknowledged that they are struggling with their mental health well-being, and they've had to take some positive action in order to focus on themselves and to get well. So it's absolutely not a weakness. We're all dealing with a wide range of stresses. So I think, again, in terms of practical actions, remembering you are an employee just the same as the people in your team. So what is the support available for you within your business? Do you have an employee assistance program? Have you accessed it? I'm sure you've probably told your team 1,000 times about it, but have you actually accessed it and got the support that's available to you there? Does your organisation offer private healthcare options? Have you accessed those? You know, really be aware of all the support that, you know, there will be masses of it out there, the support that's available to you, and to take advantage of all of it, and really have that focus on yourself in terms of trying to get well. If you work for a small business and perhaps they don't have those resources, then we are lucky to have the NHS in this country, and although the waiting list might be a bit longer than perhaps going private, we are all entitled to talking therapies from the NHS, and also your doctor is your first port of call to find out the best course of treatment for you. And there's a whole range of online resources available for free as well, often some online sort of cognitive behavioural therapy courses, depending on what it is that you need or the support that would be helpful for you. So find out what's available. You probably already know it because you've talked to your team about it, but don't forget that you can access that support for yourself as well. And I think the other thing is around not being afraid to actually pick up the phone one day to your boss and have to call in sick. You know, there's that research that went out with the Thriving at Work report about the cost to the economy of poor mental ill health. And sickness absence, from the top of my head, I think it was about £8 billion in terms of the cost of that to the UK economy. But that was actually dwarfed by the cost of presenteeism. Presenteeism is where perhaps someone is not well enough really to be at work, but they come into work, they're present at work, but perhaps they're making mistakes. Perhaps they are just not being as productive as they normally would be. They're not performing to the level that they normally would be. And actually that costs businesses an awful lot more than just someone being off for a period of time and taking some time to get well. And you know, I'm sure we can all remember perhaps bosses that we've had where you just think, you know, what's going on? I haven't heard from them for a while, or that, you know, that they haven't. You're probably getting a bit frustrated with them because perhaps you're feeling they're a bit ineffectual, and perhaps you're having a bit of a grumble with your teammates about your boss. Now, you know, with hindsight or in reflection, then what may have been going on with that boss is that they are overwhelmed, they're stressed, but they're in work, and they're perhaps not performing to the level that they need to be performing at. Now, that was probably stressful for you as the team member, if they're not able, you know, if they weren't performing where they needed to be. It's probably very, very stressful for that manager. You know, those feelings of overwhelm, and that kind of elevated stress level. They may have been making mistakes. There may have been issues with their boss, you know, in terms of things not happening. So actually, it's probably a very unpleasant situation for everyone involved there. And actually, just taking some time off, yeah, that comes, you know, puts pressure on other people in the business, perhaps for a shorter period of time. But in the longer term, taking that time to get well and come back to work with your stress bucket at at a manageable level, I think that's the best solution really for everyone involved, rather than dragging yourself in when just really you're not well enough to be at work.
Absolutely. And I guess the one thing that I would add to that is that if you need support now, don't forget that you can pick up the phone and dial 999, and that there are charities, including Samaritans, who are there to talk 24/7 to you as well. That's
Absolutely.
really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
A sort of final question for me before I throw open to the audience, and we've had some great questions come through to us already, so thank you, but please do keep on sending them in. You've touched on this a little bit already, but at the beginning of the year, it was at the end of day one back at work that Boris Johnson was back on the television and told us that we'd be going into full national lockdown again. And I'm sure many of us were sitting there on that first day feeling that was an inevitability, but not entirely sure when that was quite going to happen. And I felt compelled to write to my team and to tell them how I was feeling. And I felt that whilst I didn't know what it was that I needed to do to make myself feel better in that situation, I absolutely knew what I needed not to do to feel better in that situation. And I shared with my team some of the things that I felt that I might do over the next couple of weeks to keep myself well, and encourage them to consider what they might need for themselves. Now, I appreciate that I work in mental health. Is it sort of a fortuitous position that I'm in because of that I'm able to have that conversation with my team? You talked earlier on about some business leaders who have had those opportunities as well. Is that just because they're in that position of hierarchy? Is it possible that people might see that as a bit of a chink in my armour, or an element of weakness? Or is this a resource, an opportunity that everybody has access to?
Yeah, really good question, and I guess tricky one to answer, because I think a lot of it will hinge on the culture of the workplace in which you're working. So yeah, you probably are in a fortuitous position, because I imagine that you felt pretty confident that the reaction of your teammates would be nothing but empathetic, understanding, probably quite appreciative that you had felt that you could share how you were feeling, and that you were also concerned for the well-being of the mental health of your teammates. Probably not everywhere has that sort of quite very open culture that we do, but I think as managers are leaders as well, and no matter where you are in that hierarchy, I think you do have to think about, well, how do I want things to be around here? What do I want the culture to be like? And if you are trying to encourage your team to be open and to feel that it's okay to not be okay, and if you do want your team members to talk to you in your one-to-ones about how they're feeling, about how pressures, stress might be impacting on their performance, what support they might need, then again, it's back to that role modeling behavior. It's, if your team members can see you displaying that behavior, then then they think, oh well, must be okay. I feel a bit more confident to do that as well. So I think it's important to think about the culture you want to have where you work, and to think about how you can role model behaviours that would lead to your team feeling like that. I think it is important to have a bit of a think about what you want to share. It can be easy to perhaps blurt something out and then you might massively regret it afterwards. So we'd always recommend just stopping and thinking, well, what do I want to share? How far do I want to go? How do I want to communicate this? If you tell someone in a Zoom meeting or a face-to-face meeting, then it's in that sort of contained space. If you put it out on Twitter, or on a blog or on the intranet or something, and it's in written form, and that's a lot harder to control where it goes, and harder to get it back in if you actually decided that you didn't want to say as much as you had done. So just taking some time to think about what you want to say, how you want to say it, in what forum, and who you want to say it to. But we really, I would recommend being open, because otherwise how are we ever going to get to the point where the stigma around mental health has gone, and we are operating in a world where it's okay not to be okay.
It's one of these very peculiar times, isn't it, where we've been thrust into a situation where we all now have a window into each other's home lives by virtue of this the situation that we're in with home working, and that is an incredibly important point to make there, Sarah, that it is still up to you to determine what it is that you share, and the method that you do that in can impact on your ability to recall that if you feel that you want to change the circumstance down the line. So that's really, really useful information. Now, we've had some fantastic questions come through here, as I've said. I'm going to start off with an easy one for you, Sarah, because there's some juicy ones in here too, but let's get warmed up quite quickly. The first question is, how important are stress risk assessments?
Yeah, really good question. For anyone who isn't sure what they are, so this is a tool that's provided by the Health and Safety Executive. I say a tool actually for organisations to do an organisational stress risk assessment. It's a requirement really, but there are individual stress risk assessments that you can do. And basically, what the stress risk assessment acknowledges is that there are generally 6 domains, 6 areas of work that may be impacting on our stress. So that could be the demands of the role. Is there too much to do at the moment? Are the demands of the role manageable? What about work relationships? That can be a key stressor. Feeling that you have got control and a bit of autonomy over how you do your work, whether or not you feel that you've got the skills to be able to do your job. So there are a number of different domains contained within the Health and Safety Executive's stress risk assessment. And I think that they are really important because when someone is feeling stressed, and particularly stressed at work, everything can start to feel overwhelming. And the go-to place is often, well, I've just got too much to do. But it's really worth unpicking all those different areas, because is it the demands and solely the demands and the workload, or actually is there some confidence or skills gaps there where some training might be able to be a mitigation against that risk? Is it something to do with a relationship and there needs to be some positive, whether it's mediation or whatever the relationship issue might be, that might mitigate against that risk? So being clear about exactly what might be causing the stresses, and then looking at some practical ways to mitigate against those risks is really important. And I think often they're used when someone's been off sick and they're preparing for return to work, and that's great. I wouldn't say to not use it in that situation, but actually what we would be recommending is to use it in a much further upstream. Do it proactively. Do one with your staff instead of a one-to-one, for example, because life has changed. Although we've been working this way for almost a year now, haven't we? But stresses that were part of sort of office life, this home working or this kind of COVID work life has got its own stresses now. So it's absolutely worth doing a fresh one. and sort of thinking about the new stresses that we might be experiencing because of COVID, and then looking at ways to mitigate against those risks. And if you can get in early before someone's too stressed, before their stress bucket is too full, then hopefully you will avoid them having to go through feeling terrible and then potentially being off work.
So sounds like they are something that really is quite important. And is that something that we can signpost viewers to when we contact everybody a little bit later on today? Excellent, that's really good.
Absolutely, yeah.
Great. Okay, on to the next one then. So the question says, how do you help your team with their stresses when the main stressor in the organisation is job design, workload and culture? Until you change that, how do you manage your teams when they may think, what's the point? Nothing's going to change.
Really good question. Hard one to answer, because I think there are a few things, and I guess, you know, again, there's that quote around, you know, be the change that you want to see in the world. So although depending on where you are in the business, you might just think, well, there's no point because, you know, I can't affect the change that's needed here. But I think we all can do something. And we talked earlier about role modelling behaviours, particularly around culture. So can you as a leader role model some behaviours that around it's okay not to be okay, or about however it is that you feel that change needs to be, to then make your team feel and operate in a slightly different culture. The job design one is a difficult one, and I think that's then, you know, trying to sort of manage upwards. So are there, you know, is it possible to review at kind of annual appraisal time someone's job role? How do you, you know, what are the mechanisms for you then feeding in changes that you think are needed to be made, whether that's into HR or into your leadership? You know, sorry, can you just repeat the bit of the question? I'm trying to scroll down.
No, sorry, I've moved it over to one side. It was about you know, when the organisational structure is the challenge, how do you sort of mitigate against staff feeling sort of apathetic to the situation, as there's unlikely to be any change?
Yeah, I think there are always things that you can do, even if they're quite small things, and whether or not that's having a sort of a group supervision with your team around, okay, well, what kind of things can we change, and whether or not that's something to do with work-life balance. You know, in your team, can you agree that you will have meeting-free periods, you know, between 1 and 2, for example, or Zoom-free periods? You know, whatever it is that seems to be the issue, what can you guys as a team influence and change in a positive way? And then how do you share that learning? You know, if actually that's worked well for your team, are there forums within your business which allow you to share best practice and say, look, this is really working for us, and encourage other teams, other departments? So it really becomes kind of a bottom-up approach, as well as, you know, there does need to be a top-down part of it as well, in terms of that senior leadership buy-in to changing culture, but there can also be that sort of bottom-up element as well.
Fabulous, thank you. I'm going to move us on to the next question. Really interesting one here. It said, owing to the nature of my work in manufacturing, I have over 50 people that report into me, and some of the things that you've talked about today I'd really like to do, but simply don't have time. What are the pros and cons of carrying out some of these activities in groups, or do you have any other suggestions?
Yeah, I think I mentioned group supervisions a few times now, and I think they are really powerful. And I guess when we talk about a group supervision in the mental health world, it is about coming together to share learning, to share best practice, to share issues, and to agree some positive actions off the back of it, really. So you know, you could pick a topic, and it might be around you know, completing a wellbeing action plan. It might be bringing in someone external to facilitate a session with a group, you know, an hour-long session with a group of your staff. You know, you've got a group of 50 there. You could either try and, do them all in one hit and sort of have some external speaker come in to talk about things like the stress bucket, talk about the 5 ways to well-being, or perhaps split them into 2 smaller groups. I think then it can be useful to have kind of those regular group sessions. It is important though to instill that culture. There will always be people who perhaps feel a bit uncomfortable talking in a group environment. So again, it's about role modelling, and also actually stressing sort of the boundaries of the conversations in those group settings, setting some ground rules around sort of how and when information might be shared. I don't think as a manager you can ever guarantee 100% confidentiality, because if someone in that group said something that was actually concerning, you were worried about that person's safety, then you may well have to escalate that to an HR department or otherwise. So setting some ground rules is key, but absolutely I think you can do things in a group, and it's positive from that group learning perspective. People will bring their experiences and share them with others, and there's that shared learning, and that's really how adults learn, is around kind of shared experiences.
Fabulous. Sorry, go on.
No, I think there was pros and cons, wasn't there? Obviously there will be some cons. Some people won't want to open up, and like I said, kind of putting those ground rules in place can be one way to help that. But there may be some colleagues where you have identified some changes in behaviour, some that you are concerned about, and perhaps you will have to sort of target them and have that one-to-one conversation with them. But for other more general sort of well-being matters, then look to do those in a group setting.
Right. And assuming that circumstances allow, what is the frequency that you would suggest checking in with employees?
Good one. I think when sort of COVID hit, it was all panic stations, wasn't it? And everyone was having sort of daily calls, daily Zooms at 9 o'clock or whatever. And I think things have changed. Things have sort of calmed down a bit now. And I would actually ask your team what they would find useful. Some people may still find a weekly check-in useful. Others may find it on a monthly basis, kind of a monthly one-to-one will suffice for them. I think as a manager, the key thing really is knowing your team, knowing that, John over here is homeschooling and has got all of this going on, but Jill over here, has got quite a different setup. What are the different issues that might be impacting on these different staff members? What are their stresses? How do those stresses manifest themselves in those different staff members? Because really it's about recognising change. If you see that one of your staff members is acting differently to how they normally are, and you are concerned that that's a sign of perhaps stress or poor mental well-being, then that would be a trigger to proactively check in with that person. So I think it's about asking them what they want, but also keeping an eye out for changes and sort of being proactive and trying to troubleshoot where you can.
Right, and that leads me onto another question here, which says, I'm really worried about a member of staff in my team. It's got to the point now where it's impacting on my mental health and I'm taking it home with me every day. I've tried to have the conversation with them several times, but it's not really working. How do I break this cycle?
Difficult one. And I think, the fact that you've identified it's impacting on your own mental health and well-being is positive. At least you've identified that that's an issue. And I think, with the spirit of what we've talked about today, you can't pour from an empty cup. So please do, take some time to be looking at how you can improve or better your mental health and well-being and what support is available for you. Tricky one in terms of the colleague who you can't get through to. That is always a conundrum. One phrase that we often recommend using is, I've noticed ... and I'm wondering, to see if that is one way to get into the conversation. Because if you have noticed something concrete, is it a performance issue? Is it a change of behaviour? Whatever it is that you've noticed, this thing that is causing you concern, use that as your opener. I've noticed X and I'm wondering, are there issues outside of work that might be impacting on your performance at work? Is there something in work that is impacting on you that I might be able to support with? asking quite open questions around, is there anything that I can do to help you? Is there anywhere, that you feel comfortable getting support? If it's still sort of a no, I'm fine, but actually work performance is being impacted, then I would suggest getting some support perhaps from your HR department, because it may be that you explore the kind of performance support or management route, but always in the back of your mind that the issue for the performance might be a health issue. And that can actually often in businesses open up some other options. So, could that person have a referral for occupational health assessment, for example, to read and see whether or not they would feel comfortable discussing any issues, or trying to see whether or not perhaps some of the work or performance issues are related to a health issue, and that there might be some support that could then get put in place. So that it's tricky without knowing the ins and outs, but I would do try some of those options and see if they're useful.
Super, thank you. I hope for whomever has asked that question that provides some support and guidance there. I'm just going to bring this to a close in a moment, but I'm just going to ask you, there's just a couple more questions there. One is around the link between nutrition and mental health. Where does that feature within our 5 ways to wellbeing?
Really, really good point, actually. And I don't know, the New Economics Foundation research was done quite some time ago, so whether or not it was done at a time before the more recent research that's come out around the links between gut health and mental health. So I guess I can't answer why it's not in there, but there are always, we always normally add some extras to the 5 ways, which is around eating well and also sleeping well, trying to sleep well. So absolutely, great point. And we would say that is a key factor in terms of well-being, is sort of healthy eating and trying to get enough sleep.
Mm. And just finally, Sarah, this one's come in a couple of times to us. So I'm going to try and amalgamate a couple of questions here. We've talked a lot about, as managers, what it is that we can do for our team. But ultimately, if you're sitting in an environment or with leaders that don't understand mental health, or perhaps have practices that aren't particularly conducive to the recommendations that we're making here, again, I think this is something that we could talk about at length another day, and we probably will. But how might you respond to that as a manager? What can you do for your staff?
Yeah, I think in terms of what you can do for your staff, it is about that role modelling and trying to foster a culture within a culture within your team. I think if you are able to influence upwards, trying to tap into what's or might be important to those more senior leaders. If they are very monetary focused or business focused, then actually there's evidence out there that not investing in the mental health and wellbeing of your staff is actually very costly, from a productivity point of view, and then also ultimately from a financial point of view. So trying to make the business case really as to why those senior leaders should be bothered about the mental health and wellbeing of their staff. And again, we have various resources and training courses that can help for those senior leaders to really be able to make the case for investment.
Super. Listen, thank you so much. I think what I'm going to do is try and bring us to a bit of a close there. We've talked about an awful lot of resources today, and when Sarah and I get off of this webinar, we're just going to collect our thoughts about the conversation that we've had, and we'll send through to you later on today, not just a recording of this webinar so that you can share with your colleagues and with your organisation, but some of the tools that we've talked about and anything else that we feel might aid with some of the discussion that we've had today. If you want to carry on this conversation, please feel free to reach out to Sarah or I on LinkedIn. You can also contact us at partnerships@mentalhealth-uk.org, or visit us on our website, where much of the things that we've been talking about today can be downloaded. Now, if you've enjoyed today's session and have found it useful, please make sure to hold the time in your diary at 10 o'clock on the 12th of February, where I'll be talking to Mental Health UK's Head of Young People's Programmes, Enda Egan, and we'll be talking about how to talk to young people about building their resilience through COVID-19. And this is both a webinar for parents of teenagers in particular, and employers as well. So listen, thank you again, everybody, for your time, and I wish you a really happy and pleasant rest of your Fridays. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye bye.